So I'm really glad to be here. It's an honor to have you. Honor to me for you to have me back. I want to speak very well of my wife Elizabeth, a lifelong partner, and she's from Vicksburg, which is where we met and wed, and then moved to Huntsville. So she's pretty excited about this. If it's got Vicksburg in it, she wants it.
Does she ever correct you? Does she ever correct you?
No, that would mean he would have to be wrong at some point.
Yeah. My dad's
You
property,
want-
my dad's property was right on Confederate Avenue.
Well,
So
okay.
that's where I was born and raised.
You know, there's an old, reminds me of an old joke. What did they say? If a man is in a forest all alone and utters a sound, is he still wrong?
Yep.
Well, I'm trying something new this time. I'm experimenting with a new approach to talking, lecturing. And what it is I'm going to give you a list of questions, and then you'll memorize the answers as you go through. And okay, there won't be any exam, but it might help. Actually, you mentioned you're anxious to learn something, and this should happen. I find that we tried this at what we call the Little Round Table in Huntsville, and it seems to work pretty well. It keeps people on focus rather than jumping down rabbit holes and willy-nilly changing the subject and the like. So that's it. Yeah. And so hopefully,
Thank you, sir.
tonight. And then after you learn, you go ahead and just take two. Keep one for your wife. Okay. And then, there's a little space in there if you want to write in the space and that sort of thing. I think it'll help. So, tonight, I want to talk about two things: joint operations and Grant's Vicksburg campaign. I'll spend some time on both because they just go hand in hand so well. And I'll start with some of the necessary background information to show you how joint operations evolved into making Vicksburg the most important spot on the map in 1863. And notice I didn't mention Gettysburg. All right? Now, it's a big topic that points out the sort of tragic mismatch of the forces on the rivers. You just got to deal with that. That's history. And I'm also, I'm going to open with a question. The first question on your list, so you keep track of them. What was the major Union strategy for defeating the Confederacy? Well, you're probably thinking of the coastal blockade, but it was much broader than that. It was domination of the waters of the Old South, and neither the Army or the Navy could do it independently. It had to be done jointly. Of course, that almost answers the next question: what is a joint operation? Well, in this particular war, I know that an exact definition of joint operations is kind of slippery. So I've learned to just say, in this war, it meant Army and Navy operating together, working together. The closest synonymous term for us here is amphibious. Now, we ask, why is it important for the Army and Navy to work together? Well, basically, it was about having too much land to cover, bad roads, but also with many navigable rivers. The land was hard enough for armies to march on when it was dry, and nearly impossible when wet. But rivers and coastal waters were plentiful in the South, and they were the dominant means of transportation. Rivers and shores completely surrounded the Old South, and in the interior, water connected more strategic points than anything else. But as the old song goes, there's too many rivers to cross. And that's especially true in the East, where the rivers are relatively short, come out of mountains not very far away from the coast, run generally parallel, toward the Atlantic, whereas in the west, the rivers are much longer. I can't really use my pointer on this, but there's the Mississippi River going up, joining the Cumberland and the Tennessee River, which altogether, most of these various rivers, the navigable ones, join and run through several southern states to get into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's really, waters were, and especially in the west, the waters were the primary invasion routes from both directions, north and south. There was a basic problem. Traditionally in regular warfare, armies fought on land, navies fought at sea. Inland rivers were in army territory, but the army not only lacked or had an insufficient number of boats, and also lacked the expertise to manage them with the proper, say, military discipline. And so, besides that, the existing regular U.S. Army in 1861 was small, maybe 15,000 in number, and spread out in garrisons from coast to coast. Equally difficult for the Navy was that the seacoast and intercoastal waterways and the rivers were generally too shallow for regular naval forces to control. And then too, the Navy acting alone could not close ports, nor could they occupy and take possession of land ports. For that, they needed Army support. On the other hand, the Army needed Navy support because they couldn't maneuver freely in the southern interior to occupy all the strategic points they needed, which just happened to exist mostly on rivers. So they had to rely on each other, but their end was yet another problem. Neither service branch could command the other. As different departments, they could only request cooperation from each other. So all that, plus the scarcity of Army troops in the beginning, made joint operations essential almost immediately. The next question is, how did rivers compare to railroads for military transportation? Well, one thing we always hear is that railroads dominated transportation during the war. They were certainly gaining in importance in the Southlands, but in 1861, especially in the West, railroads primarily connected river ports, and railroads could be easily destroyed. Whereas, on the other hand, it's pretty hard to destroy a river.
Yeah.
And, but anyway, as everyone seems to know, back then, armies only marched everywhere or took a train. I heard that a long time ago on TV. So it's gotta be right. Well, we know that's not exactly true because the primary means of mobilization for the Union armies anyway, was what? It was rivers. And to prove it, just look at their names. Army of the, fill in the blank, Potomac, Cumberland, Tennessee, Ohio River, etc. And in comparison, no army was named after a railroad. Facing wartime urgencies, U.S. planners quickly realized that defeating the South militarily could only be accomplished by dominating the waters. And of course, that was no small task. It's widely agreed that the southern shoreline was around 3,500 miles long, which included 89 harbors and navigable river inlets. But the tidal coastline, which included the shores of barrier islands and the many inshore bays and back bays and whatnot, added many more miles, and in addition, thousands of miles of navigable rivers reached into the interior, especially west of the Appalachians, where they connected all the major cities on the Mississippi and its major tributaries by steamboat. The navigable river length from New Orleans to Pittsburgh alone was 2,000 miles, and navigation extended to many other remote cities like Shreveport and Kansas City. And there was some traffic even up to Omaha, Nebraska. Thank you very much, Omaha. And in case you're thinking only of Grant as the first to use joint ops, let's take a look at what joint operations preceded Grant's Vicksburg campaign. We have several examples, starting with virtually the only Union wins in 1861, which was Hatteras Inlet, Royal Sound, and Ship Island. And then in 1862, we have Forts Donelson and Henry, Roanoke Island, Island number 10, New Madrid, Pittsburgh Landing, or Shiloh, New Orleans, Memphis, and Chickasaw Bayou. So, as you can see, joint ops caught on very, very quickly. And in 1863, up to and including Vicksburg, we can add Arkansas Post, the Vicksburg bypass operations by water. That was Grant's Canal, Yazoo Pass Expedition, Lake Providence Canal, and Steele's Bayou Expedition. And there was also the Duckport Canal and Bruinsburg Crossing in April. I checked the date on that, April 29th, which is also the date of a little fake forward Snyder's Bluff. We'll talk about it a little bit later. During and after, and we're not done. During and after Vicksburg, of course, there was the siege of Vicksburg itself, the Red River Expedition, Milliken's Bend, Helena, Arkansas, the siege of Charleston, Cracker Line, Red River Campaign, the Virginia Overland Campaign. Yes, there's water on the sides of that campaign, and operations on the James and Appomattox Rivers. There was the Mobile Campaign and the Second Battle of Fort Fisher. The odd fact is that most of these actions did not originate at some planning desk in Washington. They were made up in the field by local Army and Navy commanders, of course, under the guidelines of the broader domination strategy. It's popularly known as the Anaconda Plan, but I diverge. All this may seem odd because joint operations were only recently made possible, and so we ask, what made those joint operations possible? Well, it was steam power, a whole lot of it, and a whole lot of steamboats. In fact, there were 735 steamboats on the western rivers alone in 1860. But virtually all the river traffic in the west came to a screeching halt when the war broke out. And it was a great shock to farmers, planters, merchants, commercial haulers, and as well as the carriers of passengers and mail. Many steamboat owners, in fear of financial loss, skewed back to the Ohio River, where most of them originated from, or else either sold or abandoned them in place. In the vacuum left behind, some of the seceded states acquired the limited number of stranded steamboats and quickly armed them for Army and Navy service. And the next question then is, well, what about Confederate joint operations? Did they have any? Well, yes, they did. And I'm going to limit the talk to the operations in the West, and I can't even cover all of them. They're pretty big. But historically, rivers and intercoastal waterways have served the South very well. And it's probably because of that, very well, I would say this, in transporting cash crops from plantations to the ports of sale. So well, it probably inhibited the growth of railroads for a long time. But it was, some of the states were catching up, Alabama in particular was catching up. It was the fastest growing, Alabama and Tennessee were the fastest growing railroad building parts of the South. And so the main Confederate war fleets in the West, we can call those joint, it was called the River Defense Fleet. There was also the CSS Arkansas and some landlocked would-be privateers, as well as a handful of stray service vessels. The 14 steamers of the River Defense Fleet over there on the left they were strong, fast river tugs, found mostly at New Orleans, and they were converted into armed and lightly armored rams. Now, the ram was yet another weapon. The boat itself was a weapon, and they were very effective. I'd say that I say they were joint operations because they too were Army. This ram gunboat fleet, they too were Army, but with civilian captains and a confusing mix of Army and Navy the higher ranking officers, or the officers in their higher command. 8 of those rams were sent north as far as New Madrid, Missouri, for protection of Memphis, while 6 stayed below at New Orleans. This is kind of an interesting part because you see New Madrid as one fortified place, and island number 10 as yet another, and yet a third fortified place was across the river, on this side of the river, that loaded with big guns. Loaded. virtually impassable, or believed to be for a long time. But the Army couldn't break it alone, nor could the Navy break it alone. It took a combined effort from both. Collectively, the river defense fleet fought at New Orleans, New Madrid, Plum Point Bend, that's Tennessee, and also Memphis and the Yazoo River. After being driven from New Madrid in March and April, the Upper River Defense Fleet retreated to Memphis. We probably should have gone further down to the Yazoo River, just above Vicksburg, to protect the CSS Arkansas, which was being finished there. It began at Memphis, and for having to abandon Memphis after Island number 10, they went to the Yazoo River.
Isn't that also the ship that's in Columbus, Georgia now?
No,
The CSS Arkansas, wasn't that?
no.
Or is it the flag that's there, froze from the
There might be
CSS
a flag,
Arkansas?
but there's an ironclad gunboat down there, USS Jackson.
It must have been the flag then, from the Arkansas.
Might have been, I don't recall that. I was there, but I've slept since then. And my eyesight's worse, that's why I'm using big font. But anyway, the Arkansas was towed to Memphis after the fall of Island number 10 for completion. But instead of going up the Yazoo for full protection of that priceless ironclad, they took a stand at Memphis. And some people's minds rather wrongfully taking a stand at Memphis because they took a stand against the whole fleet of Union ironclad rams and the ironclads and rams. Excuse me. The Union rams were not ironclad, by the way. And of course, that was a big fleet of gunboats. It brings up, and the question is now, what about all those gunboats? Which branch of the armed services started raising gunboats on the Western rivers? Oh, did I miss this? That's a nice picture, by the way. Okay. Yeah. That's at Yazoo, near Yazoo City. And it's pretty much like, they talk about the Roanoke, let's see, which one is slips. The Cornfield ironclad, this one raced too. This is practically built out in the weather. So, which branch of the armed services started raising gunboats on the Western rivers? It was actually the armies of both sides. But the U.S. Army realized that warfare on the brown waters was just too big of a job and asked the Navy to help in the selection and conversion of, I think this is a little noisy right now, please. Asked the Navy to help in the selection and conversion of river steamers into gunboats. For this, the Navy sent Commander John Rogers out west to make it happen. Out west at Cincinnati, he purchased at Army expense the first 3 gunboats, the so-called timberclads, the Lexington, Tyler, and Conestoga, all light and fast wooden river boats, which he strengthened the hulls of and armed. Later came some 70 light and fast so-called tinclads, also with wooden hulls, but only lightly armored with half-inch iron boilerplate. Rogers also contracted for the Union's first heavy ironclads, that is those ones with the 2-inch iron plating on the casemates. These were the 7 Carroll class. I'm going to say Carroll, by the way, not Cairo. I've been somewhat corrected on that. And if you're interested, I'll tell you why. But go ahead. Okay. So I'm going to try to say Carroll from now on. Carroll class gunboats built by James Eads, who also converted a couple of other rugged river steamboats into ironclads, the Benton and the Essex. And whereas the ironclads stood as the counterparts to the Army's heavy artillery, the timberclads and tinclads acted like cavalry with light artillery. Light cavalry, the faster gunboats served in several ways, such as being an independent lightning strike force or the iron of the fleet. They also destroyed enemy gunboats and sawmills, about anything that saw on the river looked useful to the other side, blow it away. They also probed enemy defenses, acted as river police, and guarded convoys. And although the Army paid for them, They were commanded by Navy officers, and the crews were a mix of soldiers, sailors, and civilians. Jumping now to early 1862, we have a big joint exercise by Grant and Navy Captain Foote in the battles of Forts Henry and Donaldson. Right after Henry and Donaldson, Generals Grant and C.F. Smith and V.C. Buell prepared a campaign up the Tennessee River, did you get that, up the Tennessee River, to capture the rail junction at Corinth, Vicksburg was on their minds at the time. Okay, we couldn't call that a Vicksburg campaign yet, but it was on their minds. So taking large transports and 2 gunboats, on one from Foote, they disembarked at Pittsburgh Landing to wait for General Buell on a separate march from Nashville. And there, they bivouacked on they parked there, bivouacked on the high ground near Shiloh Church, just as the Confederates at Corinth were amassing for an attack. So right now you might be asking, oh well, how was the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing a joint operation? Well, aside from the fact of getting the troops there by boat, the gunboats Lexington and Tyler helped to fend off a Confederate drive to sweep the Federals from the landing. That's the 2 boats over here. You can see the actual print here. But they were able to fire up a long ravine, a long deep ravine, with the trajectory of their shot, cleared the ravine and went inland perhaps 2/3 of a mile. I've got another picture here to show you. This is superimposed on a modern map from Google Earth, and you can see the ravine they fired up through, and it's different shading. It's I can't see it well as I could, but that trajectory was 45 miles, and that's a straight line shot from where the gunboats actually fired from. And so then that started during the night, and then it kept the field clear. They probably didn't want to move too much at nighttime anyway. It was real rainy, stormy that night. But during the night, a fresh division of Buell's arrived by boat from across the river. And in the morning, Grant and those fresh troops pushed the Confederates off the entire field, who then began their withdrawal back to Corinth. Meanwhile, a joint expedition by Foote and General John Pope moved down to New Madrid and Island Number 10. That's when they fought and opened the Mississippi all the way to Memphis. Pope actually came down overland, occupied New Madrid. Now what? They can't go anywhere yet. They're still, they need boats to get down on this side, come over and take out this, and the boats couldn't get by until they could blast their way across or just run past in front of the guns to eventually help them be neutralized. Now, I've talked to a lot of Army people and historians. Navy didn't have anything to do with the Island of 10, New Madrid. No, that was all. And if you read Pope's version of what went on, you wouldn't think the Navy even existed. So, well, there, Pope. Okay. Well, the end of the Corinth campaign, at least for Grant anyway, morphed into a campaign to capture Vicksburg and complete the opening of the Mississippi River. This action opened it down to Memphis. Grant's first attempt was to march overland for a direct assault upon Vicksburg, which was thwarted at Holly Springs. That's rather famous. You might have heard of that. His next activities are better remembered as the Vicksburg Campaign, which spanned more than 500 river miles between Memphis and New Orleans. So, here's the next question. What roles did Memphis and New Orleans play in the Vicksburg Campaign? The plan was to have fleets from both of those cities, and both accompanied by Army troops converging on Vicksburg at the same time. For this Captain Charles H. Davis took command of the upper fleet, consisting of the ironclads, timberclads, and mortar barges, and began moving south from Cairo to Memphis. Above Memphis, he was joined by Army Colonel Charles R. Ellett and his son I'll just call him Charlie. He was Charles Rivers Ellett, but confusing. The old man Charles Ellett, he was Charles R. Ellett Jr., but he's the father of Charlie. So to keep him straight, I don't refer to Junior up here, and I call him Charlie. Heck of a kid, 19 years old, a medical cadet when he joined his father in the ranks. And so on June 6th, the two fleets jointly knocked out the Upper River Defense Fleet right in the face of Memphis, and Memphis fell to Union control later when the Army troops moved out. The Upper River Defense Fleet was virtually destroyed in this action. One escaped and got down to the Yazoo River. Okay, ever heard pop before? Okay, so, Memphis fell to Union control, and then the Army troops moved in. Starting that month, Memphis became a permanent major military and naval supply depot for the Union. Meanwhile, Farragut moved up the Mississippi, and some 3,000 of Benjamin Butler's troops from New Orleans. He brought up a mix of ocean steamers up there on the left. They call those sloops of war. They weren't as big as, say, a frigate, but they were ocean going. And then 6 of the newly built small and identical 5-gun schooner rigged sailing steamers known as 90-day gunboats. Accompanying them were 20 mortar schooners towed by Navy Commander David Dixon Porter, and all of that, they were ordered to meet Davis's upper fleet at Vicksburg. So Vicksburg was a target, no doubt about it, and it took quite a bit of planning to get to this point even.
How were those called 90-day gunboats? Were they contracted instead of owned, or what?
It was under a fast contract that went out to, there were 23 of them.
Okay.
They went out to 23 different builders,
Okay.
constructors,
And they had
with
90
identical
days to get them
specs.
built.
With the contract that they will be delivered in 90 days. And to do that, they had they couldn't wait for timber to dry. They took green timber out of the forest, cut the tree down and made a boat out of it. Now, that's not the best way to make a boat, because the timbers swell or shrink actually.
Right.
And all those tight joints that you started with. So you better take a lot of that, what is called the oakum or whatever they pack in between the. Yeah, so 90 days, most of them were completed in that time. Not all of them, but that was why they called them 90-day gunboats. It actually served quite well in a lot of places and far outlasted the war. Far outlasted, that'd be kind of a stretch to say far outlasted, but they lasted longer than expected and as long as they were needed, which was important. And they're cheap. Okay. Well, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so there's about the 90-day gunboats. Did I talk about, yeah, okay, I got, on this boat in the middle, you can kind of see it protruding right there. But these were monsters. They were about 17,000 pounds each, 13-inch ball that could blow a mile into the air and drop off 3 miles away. They were used pretty effectively down at Forts Jackson and St. Philip. But that was already over and done with. So, let's see, what was the major reason for the Union's failure? I forgot to mention, that began the first siege of Vicksburg, which failed. And now the question, why did it fail? The major reason for the Union's failure was essentially because too many Confederate guns at Vicksburg and not enough Union Army troops to capture them. So that little disappointment for the Federals was attributed to the unwillingness of Major General Henry Halleck to break troops away from Corinth. Now, Halleck was sort of the McClellan of the West. He never had enough troops. And 120,000 troops at Corinth. There wasn't any army anywhere near that size in its proximity. He could have split it up 5 ways and still done, and maybe made his own march down to Vicksburg, down some high ground, but he didn't. Anyway, lacking army support, the siege was broken up by the Confederate ironclad ran the CS Arkansas, which had broken out of Vicksburg. Maybe that's the
Hoping it's air conditioning.
right, so seeing the futility of only lobbing shells on Vicksburg and facing the risk of being stranded in low water in the approaching dry season, both Union fleets returned to their respective former positions. It was a Confederate victory, but by default only. They had to get out of there. And the rebels knew that, and they knew that they could not afford to relax. So what did they do? They realized that Vicksburg was suddenly the key to control of some 200 miles of river in the middle, which begs this question: why did Vicksburg suddenly become the key to control? And here they were facing the reality that about 1,000 miles of river river defenses had suddenly crashed from both ends. That left Vicksburg holding the middle and also being dependent upon supplies from the Red River. This guy, the Red was a vital supply line to the breadbasket of the Western Confederacy. It was a vital connection to Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana. A tremendous amount of food supply were grown in that area. So, Lincoln, now sensing a victory, insightfully said this: Vicksburg is the key, and Confederates certainly agreed. As Jefferson Davis put it, Vicksburg was the nail holding the two halves of the Confederacy together. Now, was it a nail or was it a key? Well, in the aftermath,
Our president said nail, so it's nail.
oh, yeah, well, yeah. And so,
We know that story.
in the aftermath of that first siege, Confederates gained an instant appreciation of Vicksburg's importance as well as its vulnerability, and they responded with great urgency. This is when it went into high gear for Vicksburg. They quickly organized an army of 30,000 in Mississippi under John C. Pemberton with headquarters at Jackson. They also rushed more guns into Vicksburg and added batteries of big guns at Warrenton, just below Vicksburg, and at Grand Gulf, 30 miles further south. Port Hudson, some 200 miles below Vicksburg, was likewise heavily reinforced with troops and armament. And the question now is, what part did Port Hudson play in defending both Vicksburg and the Red River? They were important, both of them. Located below the mouth of the Red on the high banks of the Mississippi above Baton Rouge, Port Hudson became the southern anchor point of CS control of both rivers. And for the Confederates, losing either Port Hudson or Vicksburg meant losing both, as well as the Red River supply line. We had a speaker one time, a long time back, who said, Port Hudson's nothing to it, not that, not important. Come on, it's very important. Like Vicksburg, Port Hudson housed rings of guns at high elevations overlooking the river to enable them to rain shot and shell down on gunboats passing these sharp, they're both considered hairpin curves, not as extreme as Vicksburg, of course, but it was a pretty strong defense. It was easy thanks to the gun quickly. And now getting back to Grant, despite the Union victory at Shiloh, Halleck was unhappy with Grant and had him sidelined for a while. But then things started looking up. Lincoln wouldn't fire him because I don't care if he drinks, he fights. That was a version of what he said. So Halleck authorized Grant to reopen the Mississippi, even though he didn't know exactly how the man would do it. And for that matter, neither did Grant. Having been thrown back at Holly Springs several weeks earlier, Grant was still determined to take Vicksburg, but this time by way of Louisiana. How he ended up doing that? Well, he knew he could not enter Mississippi without a lot of cooperation, not just with the Navy, but with other Army departments as well. And when Grant began his movements, he did not have central command. Halleck was in charge, but he gave Grant his head to go after Vicksburg while backing him up logistically. Now the next question, when and where did Grant begin his troop movements in Louisiana, and where did he plan to land them? Well, on March 29th, Grant's movements began at Milliken's Bend, 10 miles north of Vicksburg on the Louisiana side of the river. And when he began, he did not have a planned location for crossing back over into Mississippi. He just knew it had to be somewhere below Vicksburg, and he needed Navy's boats to do it. Moreover, to march his army through the flooded parts of eastern Louisiana, which I say gray, your TV screen says pink, but it was gray to me when I started. He had to build about 100 miles of corduroy roads on these white strips coming down through here. Those are old natural levees that snaked around the old bayous and old ancient river channels. And the river itself makes levees, by the way, because as it overflows, it just starts dumping mud down on the ground below it. And eventually it builds up closest to the river channel itself. And that in and of itself keeps the river somewhat in place until something big comes along and changes. Okay, so that takes us to the next question. How are you going to be successful with this? And did I mention Milliken's Bend up here? Yeah, let's make sure you understand that. That's where it all started, Milliken's Bend. That was a Union occupied place, a landing spot, and you could get troops out of boats there or from either side, and begin this march down this dark line, which is a corduroy road, made up as they went along, piece by piece, tree by tree. And well, that's quite an undertaking. So it brings the question to me, what more than anything else was critical to Army-Navy cooperation in Grant's campaign? This question. It was really all about trust, and I mean deep trust and friendship between Grant, Sherman, and Admiral Porter. So with that, and leading up to the next question, all three of these fellows employed a variety of actions that disguised their intentions for the invasion. And their actions deceived so well that they confused not only Pemberton, but also the entire higher commands of both sides. So this becomes a big question. Were Grant and Porter's deceptions pre-planned in order to deceive, or were they just making things up as they went along, throwing out Hail Marys and hoping something would work? Well, actually, there's a little of both. So we'll keep that question in mind as we continue. First in play was a number of attempts to dig bypass canals around Vicksburg for boats and troops to pass. And I'm not saying these were fake actions intended to deceive. They were genuine attempts to get to Vicksburg. And just what attempts were made to find the water route around Vicksburg. 3 bypass canals were attempted: the Lake Providence Canal, Grants Canal, and the Duckworth Canal. All failures, but ultimately they did help to confuse. Porter also tried to find a water route to Vicksburg through the Delta by way of Yazoo Pass up here on the top, coming off it actually dynamited a levee up there. And the intention of flooding this entire thing and then being able to just go literally anywhere on this great floodplain, it didn't quite work. but, and then the other was Steele's Bayou, which is closer to Vicksburg, starts up the Yazoo River, takes off the channel. And so, just to show you what Porter was up against, that Steele's Bayou, he was nearly trapped in a veritable jungle. Let's go back to this for just a second. Going up Steele's Bayou, Fort Pemberton is over here, it's occupied by the Confederates, and they're sending folks out here to meet and greet with bullets. And but Sherman was coming up from behind. Now let's go back to this one here. This is pretty much what it looked like. They had to take down funnels off the boats to get through the trees and the snakes and the bears and whatever else is out there. And actually came under a Confederate attack saved by Sherman. Both Delta expeditions by Porter were somewhat independent, not entirely, but somewhat, which put Grant at pretty great risk, actually. If Porter had lost his gunboats in the Delta, well, he didn't show, I couldn't find a gunboat in there, but he took them all, his whole fleet of them, into the Delta, and if he'd have lost any of them, or maybe even all of them, Grant wouldn't have, he'd have to either call off the campaign or attempt another overland assault. Next question, something else is going on. How did Grant support Hurlbut and Rosecrans during his movement in Louisiana? And how was that deceptive? Well, Grant supported two seemingly independent cavalry raids outside of his command. These were Grierson's raid out of Hurlbut's command running from LaGrange, Tennessee to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Straight's raid out of Rosecrans' command running across North Alabama. I've argued with other experts on this, saying, no, Grant didn't have anything to do with that. They were independent command. Well, that's not true. Okay. Grierson's raid at first appeared to be another move in northern Mississippi, perhaps a screen for another Union attack in that sector, perhaps even by Grant. So, part of the confusion, but Grierson continued on south to cut the railroad that supplied Vicksburg, and then what would he do after that? Turn around and link back up with Grant above the city? Or would he go back to Tennessee for a restart? No one knew, certainly not Pemberton. The second cavalry raid, Straight's, was made to protect Rosecrans' supply lines in Middle and Eastern Tennessee. But again, who knew? They did come down and park first in Mississippi, but I'll get to that in a minute. The real plus for Grant, intentional or not, was that both raids created much needed diversions in his favor. Now, how did Straight's raid coincide with Grierson's? Well, they were far from pure coincidence. The two raids were launched on the same day, April 19th, 1863, both through communications with Grant, and Straight's raid with direct help from Grant. How did that work, you might wonder? Well, it had to do with the Mississippi Marine Brigade, and the question being, how did the Marine Brigade support Straight's raid? Well, I got more description about the Marine Brigade as we come down, but the answer is Grant asked Porter to send a Marine Brigade, here it is, I think, with their large transports and rams to go to Middle Tennessee. And their objective was twofold. One, to deliver mules supplied by Rosecrans to Eastport, Mississippi for Straight's cavalry. And in the bargain, this big hunkin' Marine Brigade, 14 big ones like this, and seven like that, and 7 rams, all packed together. They probably had a couple of thousand troops with them. But the Marine Brigade would defend the Tennessee River, Middle Tennessee, in order to protect Rosecrans against cavalry attacks from the western sector. And it was a highly visible movement of a large convoy loaded with troops leaving Vicksburg and going north, which gave the Confederates a false impression that Grant might have been giving up on the city. It's pretty well, there's a lot of reading that describes Grant faking these people, putting people on board transports and getting them out of there, going back north. it was a plan. It was to get these guys over onto the Tennessee River, pick up the mules, and deliver them to Strait. In the bargain, the Marine Brigade would defend the Tennessee River in Middle Tennessee, and I said that already. Highly visible movement, yeah, wrong impression. And meanwhile, during that time, Grant had finally decided on a land bypass in Louisiana. He proposed to march troops south in eastern Louisiana if Porter would ferry them back into Mississippi at some unspecified point below Vicksburg, possibly at New Carthage or Hard Times. That's actually the name of the place. You can imagine somebody so enthralled with the place they name it Hard Times. Why bother living there and name it? Yeah. Okay. Well, fortunately, Porter had just gotten out of the Delta unscathed and instantly agreed to Grant's request, even though it meant for him a dangerous passing of his fleet in the face of Vicksburg's now 37 big guns on this 5-mile stretch in front of the city. He also realized that once below Vicksburg, there may be no returning. Now, at this point, we often hear criticism of the Confederate Trans-Mississippi forces for not doing more to stop Grant in Louisiana. For that, in answer to that, we have to ask what geographic features gave Vicksburg natural protection against an invasion, not only an invasion, but how about the relief armies come to help out? Same geographic features. So for starters, the flood cycles played a big part in it. These twice yearly overflow from the Mississippi through the millennia covered much of the floodplains north and west of Vicksburg. And seasonally, the flooding provided good security for Vicksburg against attacks from those sectors. Many other geographic features also came into play. For instance, the hairpin curve itself, exactly to the west of Vicksburg, effectively made 2 river crossings from the west. And so that was hard. And then the Big Black River to the south and east of Vicksburg. Further to it, this is the Big Black right here. This is a lot of rugged country looks like that, and that's no exaggeration. That country is incredibly rough. High hills, deep ravine, high hills, deep ravine, all over the place. And so all that, plus the large system of the hills, gave Vicksburg additional shielding from attacks, and as I mentioned, those features made it difficult for the Confederate relief armies as well. That brings up this question: why was the timing of the flood season critical to Grant's passage? Well, even though the details were far from settled, Porter and Grant did not have time to sort them out. Flooding seasons very quickly turned into dry seasons, in which river levels fall and floodwaters recede across the lowlands. In dry times, much opportunity to use water transportation would be lost, plus it introduced a greater risk of overland counterattacks by Confederate forces. Flooding conditions also produced the maximum river velocity in the main channel. Maybe I back up one. The maximum river velocity in this main channel in front of Vicksburg. You can see how it not only makes a bend, but the passage narrows. And for the same volume of water come down any stream, your gutter or whatever, if the passage narrows, what has to happen? It's got to go faster. It's beats. Put the same amount of water down. Okay, so catching up here. Maximum velocity. There we are. It meant that the gunboats could move faster and spend the least amount of time in front of the guns. And so next we ask, how and where did Porter transport Grant back across the river from Louisiana? And that's kind of a long story. I'll try to make it short, but Porter ran past Vicksburg's guns, picked up the troops at New Carthage, and took them to Hard Times. See, took them to Hard Times. So you can see all the prominent points here: Vicksburg, Warrenton, Randolph, New Carthage, Hard Times, a place called the Shrew's Plantation. If you're real good about reading fine print, power to you. But that's what that says. There are two spellings of it, and they were both somewhat phonetic. What can I say? They were French, Cajun. And also you can see where Bruinsburg is. So there's a big map of the whole layout. Now it's not that Hard Times had a good crossing, but it was because of the heavy guns just below Hard Times at this place, Grand Gulf. Now that's an incredibly high hill with a direct overlook from this large pool area that's made by a giant whirlpool coming down from where the Big Black River comes into on a bend of the Mississippi at a right angle. It's a very similar situation up here near Nashville on the Tennessee River called the Suck, where it traps boats, spins them around and around and around. Okay. Well, this was bigger. Probably wasn't as intense, but anyway, that was it, and that's why they call it Grand Gulf. And so the river itself posed a threat there, and the whirlpool, they might spin boats around under the gunfire several times before they can break free. And it was just for that reason the Confederates placed the guns on that hill overlooking the whirlpool. And that hill is a monster. It's like 250 feet high or more. It's big. The Hard Times, they would have to either go back northward to find a favorable landing spot with troops aboard, while passing in front of another well-armed position at Warrenton, or go further downriver, which would put them farther away from Vicksburg, while exposing his gunboats and troop transports to deadly fire at Grand Gulf. Grant chose to go further south, but first he dropped his troops off at Hard Times and had them march across, bypassing Grand Gulf, march across this land isthmus to Dishrooms Plantation. And there, they would be picked up and taken over to Mississippi. So, on bypassing with the men safety assured, the armored gunboats and empty transports passed under Grand Gulf's blazing guns. Damage was significant, but they got through and reloaded the troops safely. But still, no one knew what Grant was going to do next, if he was going to cross into Mississippi or not. He did have an option. Lincoln expected Grant to continue on. I'll suppose the question first, what did Lincoln expect? Well, the most obvious expectation was to continue on to Port Hudson and connect with Banks and Farragut at that place, but he didn't. He chose to cross at Bruinsburg, Mississippi instead, and you might wonder, why did he pick Bruinsburg? He's going past, and he sees, there's no mention at all that this physical feature, even mentioned anywhere. It's sort of like discovered, like nobody bothered to ever talk about it. Here's a place by the river, totally undefended, a nice easy slope off the river to high and dry elevations, which is directly across from Fort Gibson, one of the places they had to knock over anyway. So Grant's going, hey, look, I'll pick that place. So that's why he picked Bruinsburg as a landing spot. And besides, it was really, let's just say that Port Hudson was out of the question in Grant's mind anyway. Why? Well, after losing at Holly Springs, Grant wanted to take the fight to Vicksburg, not to Port Hudson. Besides, Banks had Farragut with him, and as Grant reasoned, they could manage on their own. And besides, Grant really did not want to join with Banks. Why? Banks was senior, and Grant would have come under his command, which would have screwed up everything probably. It came down to simply not trusting a politically appointed general who he did not know. He had to cross over very soon now, and he's running out of space. He's getting down real close to Port Hudson. Anyway, he thought perhaps a few miles further down at Rodney, Mississippi, but at Bruinsburg, just below Grand Gulf, just west of town, Fort Gibson, he found something like this. Instead of the usual steep ravines and the cliffs and slope, it was an easy slope. And even better, Bruinsburg was below the mouths of both Big Black River and Bayou Pierre. Now, Bayou Pierre is misnamed. It's not a bayou, it's a river. I see a nod, well, yeah, it's not one of these lazy bayou things. I don't know, they probably lost count of all the bridges that's washed down, but, anyway, those two, water, channels, rivers protected his landing from Confederates on his left at Grand Gulf. Grant jumped at the opportunity and immediately landed McClernand's at McPherson's 2 Corps. How many men was that? Well, between the two of them, their 2 Corps numbered 24,000. And that was as opposed to Pemberton's 30,000 men in Mississippi, but that's kind of misleading. He didn't have 30,000 men there to beat him. They were all over the place in Mississippi. Poor old confused Pemberton was consumed, for one thing, he was consumed by fears of Grierson's cavalry being in the lead of another Union land attack from Tennessee, and nor did he yet know what Straits Race was all about. They didn't know he was going to run, take a left and go to North Alabama. So he kept his troops locked in place at Vicksburg, Grand Gulf, and Jackson as he awaited a promised relief army headed by Joseph Johnston. Now, where you went? Okay, continue. Upon landing, McClernand and McPherson forced CS troops out of Fort Gibson, and inland from there was an undefended crossing of Bayou Pierre into a long, dry ridge system going far into the northeast beyond the city of Jackson. This is very instructional. Here's the landing, here's Fort Gibson, this is called Little Bayou Pierre, this is Big Bayou Pierre. But you can see Big Bayou Pierre doesn't come from another body of water, it comes from out of headlands where water flows torrentially. So anyway, this is margin. Here's Big Black River, here's Bayou Pierre. There's some Confederate troops down this way that are reasonably well screened now from Bayou Pierre, and Big Black is that's a deep bottom river. High banks both sides, very difficult to cross, but boats could get up to the Big Black Bridge was about the upper limit of travel of steamboats. Not very big steamboats, but steamboats. And you can see Grant's march here, going up, hitting Raymond Clinton, Edwards Ferry, Champion Hill, I should say, and Big Black Bridge. Those are the majors. And so those rivers screened Grant pretty well. Now, after the Battle of Fort Gibson, Grant realized that he didn't have enough troops to support his entire operation. That's when he sent word back to Sherman to join him and to Hurlbut to send reinforcements. So yes, he had influence on another guy's command, Hurlbut's. Sherman was his own man. He was his 3rd Corps. And within a week of his landing, Grant's total was raised to about 50,000. And then Grant went on the move, and once on the move in Mississippi, there was no stopping him. After Fort Gibson, he faced toward Grand Gulf and caused the evacuation of that place, thereby creating more confusion. Now what's he up to? What does that mean? Was it to be a direct assault upon Vicksburg directly from the south? Grand Gulf is here. Lots of rugged country between here and here. What's he going to do? No one knew. So instead of that, the southern approach to Vicksburg, he pushed farther inland and fought at Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black Bridge, and then he invested in Vicksburg. In doing so, he pushed Joe Johnston's army of relief further out into the interior north of Jackson. And to reemphasize something here, there was no detailed plan. Each battle was improvised for its own unique situation. After the Big Black Bridge, Pemberton's maneuvering army of 20,000 was reduced to about 12,000. Now, that's a lot of missing pieces. Where did they all go? They weren't all killed, wounded, or missing. But missing, yes. Loring's division split off and rejoined Joe Johnston's army. So Pemberton was reduced now to about 12,000. So he returned to Vicksburg inside the protection of some rather superb defense lines made by Samuel Lockett. Grant pursued, tried and failed to break the lines, and then laid siege to the city. He left Pemberton trapped. That left Pemberton trapped in Vicksburg, waiting for the promised relief. In military axioms, a city under siege is doomed if the besieging army has a protected line of communication or supplies and reinforcements when the city has none. Perfect situation as sieges go. And so we asked, what was Sherman's role in creating let's take a look at Sherman here. Creating deceptions and in combat throughout the campaign. Sherman's part in this great deception when Grant moved south was in keeping his entire corps north of Vicksburg to confuse the defenders. To further confuse, he made a final feint towards Snyder's Bluff, just above Vicksburg. Snyder's Bluff right there. Feint toward it. To remind, well, to confuse, to give Pemberton the belief that he was still under attack from the north of the city. And that happened to be on the same day that Grant was crossing over at Bruinsburg. Pemberton reacted by concentrating his troops at Vicksburg. After Grant had successfully crossed into Mississippi, Sherman's role shifted to protecting Grant's rear in order to preserve supply lines and bring up reinforcements. So marching down from Young's Point to Hard Times, Sherman brought 20,000 of his men, his whole division, and Porter then ferried them across the Grand Gulf, which by then, you don't see on there, but by then the Confederates had evacuated. Next question. What troop strength did Grant achieve while at Vicksburg? Well, there he is on the north end of the siege lines where Grant's headquarters came, and back in close communication with the upper river, Grant received reinforcements and supplies from Memphis under the protection of several tin-clad gunboats. And while at Vicksburg, Grant's army grew to around 75,000 men, all well supplied with food, horses, and munitions directly from Memphis. And all this time of the siege, attrition is hitting the Confederate troops pretty hard. Next question. What Confederate forces posed a potential threat to Grant's campaign? Well, primarily it was Joe Johnston's army, which is much criticized, and I think perhaps wrongly. Having grown to about 30,000, his army hovered between Jackson and Yazoo City, but it stalled. Johnston's only plausible approach to relieve Pemberton was through the drive at Rugged Corridor northeast of Vicksburg. Knowing this, Grant detached Sherman for maneuvering on his northern flank. His sole job, only job, was to keep to screen Johnston's movement and keep him away. Meanwhile, Porter returned to the waters above Vicksburg to plant himself on the Yazoo, almost the Yazoo City, in order to protect Sherman's left. Now, west of the Mississippi River, Kirby Smith had two relatively strong and relatively independent forces. Richard Taylor's in western Louisiana and Theophilus Holmes's in southern Arkansas. But with a combination of the swamps, Porter, the crossing of those two forces was also well screened. At best, they could only remain alert for a chance to lure Grant away from Vicksburg. And the next question being, what effect did the Navy's presence have on those potential threats? During the siege, the naval forces dominated the river systems above Vicksburg all the way to Illinois. And this was owed to the ever-present tin-clads on patrol, as well as the return of the Mississippi Marine Brigade from Tennessee. Even as the floodplains were drying out, the naval presence on the Mississippi and the Yazoo helped to hold off both Johnston and Kirby Smith and prevent them from giving aid. And then there was the Mississippi Marine Brigade. Now, these guys especially were the terror of the rivers. With a total of these, I mentioned this before, 14 vessels, 7 large transports, and 7 small rams. And lots of soldiers, and able to fire their cannons from high decks they could dislodge hidden positions with shotgun-like grape shot. In addition, they carried mounted cavalry and infantry, and if they drew fire, they could just pull over quickly, drop the gangplank, and charge out on horseback to counterattack. Also having horse-drawn wagons, they became adept at, they called it foraging, raiding plantations and stealing towns. And they were not above burning a town if they suspected harboring an enemy force. This is kind of a favorite thing, because I think that was Atlanta, but I needed some buildings being burned. Because they did that. You ever heard of Austin, Mississippi?
Where?
Austin, Mississippi? Anybody ever heard of it?
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. You never will either. It's just inside Mississippi, below the state line between Mississippi and Memphis. They were driving by, or floating by, and they drew fire from Confederate position. They dropped the gangplank, ran them off, shot them up, and then started surveying the town, see what was in there, gathering information and stuff. And they found hidden supplies in the town, so they burned it, the whole town. So yeah, and then they burned it. Nice guys. Nice. They were bad characters. I mean, they had bad attitudes from the word go, and they couldn't get any better. Neither the Army or the Navy would supply them, so the only way they could get any sustenance is foraging on their own. And they became experts and pretty neat about it.
Stole women's clothes too.
I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so, and what other joint Union efforts helped to seal Union from the Vicksburg's fate in open Mississippi? Well, Union gunboats helped to fend off 2 attacks on outposts above Vicksburg, Milliken's Bend and Helena, Arkansas. The one at Milliken's Bend is shown here, where the Lexington and Choctaw protected the flanks of this fighting, mostly African-American soldiers. And the other one was at Helena, where the gunboat Tyler helped to save the Union stronghold. And the accounts give the Tyler great credit for virtually decimating the attacks coming down, especially this road on the left. They had a direct line of shot clearing the town. The town itself was at the lowest elevation, right by the river, and the basic thing is still there, but all the high stuff was on the backside of it. So they didn't really have any trouble, again, shooting up ravines. They could get a clear line of sight to the Confederates on this road, and it really tore them up. And so, in the end of all that, on July 4th, when the Confederates gave up on this and left, and Vicksburg surrendered, at that point, Grant proved he was a master of large-scale operations that transcended traditional departmental lines. In total, all of the parts of the campaign are still being studied by the military today. The deceptive actions, whether planned or not in all cases, is debatable, but there was a need, they did confuse, and the timing was perfect. Probably least understood, at least appreciated, however, is Grant's use of the forces afloat. And so now I give you your last question left for you to fill in the blanks. Now, the question is, the overall Vicksburg campaign was what in nature, anyone? What nature was it?
Water.
Amphibious, good. All right. Which required the domination of the what? Somebody said it already.
Rivers.
Waters. Yeah. And it was made possible only by what?
Joint.
Efforts across Army and Navy lines. Fast learners, y'all. And then the bottom line of all that is this: without the Navy, there would not have been a Vicksburg campaign.
Sorry.
So I leave that to you. I'll take questions if you like.
So that's on the first Vicksburg campaign where it failed, was that less cooperation between the Navy and the Army, or was it just, I know there was a lot of mud and,
Well, I
you know,
think
getting
you're
bogged
hitting,
down?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. Cooperation was a big thing, but it required a lot of troops, certainly some troops from Halley, who certainly could have broken some loose. So, yeah, that was a big disappointment. You know, the Navy was pretty pumped to do it. They had all the means available to them to do it with. The timing was pretty good when they first got there, but it stalled out, and, well, let's see, where's all those troops supposed to be coming down from Memphis or someday place? And, they didn't, just go there, so the river was falling,
Right.
they couldn't.
They were
get-
worried about not being
they
able to
couldn't-
get back out.
Yeah, they'd be stranded there, both fleets, above and below, they'd be stranded. No way to get out. Dry season lasts a long time. They got out actually in July, which is pretty late. And they really could not have waited any longer. You know, Butler really couldn't have spared much more than the 3,000 he did.
Okay.
Hold on, comment, I agree with your comment you made about Joe Johnson.
Yeah.
It seemed like every place the guy went, he ran criticism for one thing or another, but in that, the Army of Relief that went over there, he tried his best to get Pemberton to come out of Vicksburg on the north side of Vicksburg, and he had a plan for joining with him to fight off Grant, but he couldn't get Pemberton to do it. Pemberton was still so, beat up and depressed from Champion Hill, and he wasn't about to try to come
Pemberton
out.
hands were tied, when it comes right down to it. I'm glad you brought that up. Joe Johnston comes along with, and he was getting reinforcements from Tennessee and also from Beauregard out of Virginia. So his forces were growing some too. Now, here's Pemberton sitting there with direct conversation, in direct communication with the head man himself, Jefferson Davis, said, hold Vicksburg at all costs. That's not a good plan for war. All right? And you do not want your city besieged, of course, but it's better to lose the city than to lose your army. And with Pemberton, he lost both. And I don't think it's Pemberton's fault either, because Davis told him to get there and stay there. Hold Vicksburg at all costs. Well, what's the guy supposed to do? Bail out because of Joe Johnson said to? Joe Johnson was right. You know, he should have rejoined with him. And you may give up the city for a while, but if you have a good fighting maneuvering army is the trick, not one that's stationary. You got a chance to regain it. Or maybe you could haul off an attack at Memphis and get all those supplies back in your shopping cart. So, I think Joe Johnson's much maligned on that. Now, it is true that he was not highly enthusiastic about big engagements. He'd rather save his army than waste them. And there's a lot to be said for that. All in all, it was an impossible situation for Pemberton and Joe Johnston. Because here, the only way he could get it to Vicksburg was go through Sherman. And Sherman was a scrappy guy. That was they were seasoned veterans by that time, and it would have been a tough job. That's all I can say. And you saw the geographic features too. It's not like there's a Overland, some Interstate 20 or something, Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to talk about that anyway.
Heard that Vicksburg is worth the drive, even though it's a long way down there, there's a lot to see.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
it is, it absolutely is.
Natchez is a good town, but
Confederate, yeah.
It's worth it for you, wasn't it?
It's still there.
Isn't that where Scales is doing his next trip, I think?
Yes, John Skills is in
Yeah,
October.
yeah, we're planning a trip there in October, so, yeah.
Good luck.
Y'all can get on board too.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes,
The attitude of the Union troops, you were talking about the attitude of the Union troops.
yeah,
I read one diary written by a Southern lady at the time. It talked about the Union troops stealing the women's clothes from her and her friends
yeah,
and
let's see.
shipping them back north
I suppose.
to their wives.
I can't imagine,
That was
I can't imagine
major
stealing them
complaint.
away daily, but.
They weren't just getting food, rummaging for food, but they
Yeah,
were.
oh yeah, they could take anything that wasn't nailed down, yeah. Yeah, but this river bunch, the Mississippi Marine Brigade, they really got started on the wrong foot in the first place. They were promised the easy duty, soldiering made easy was their catchphrase on the recruiting posters. And that didn't work really well until they started. They went to hospitals where they enticed convalescing soldiers that really kind of had it with fighting by that time anyway. And so this kind of looked pretty attractive. They wouldn't have to desert, you know, they'd still be in a unit that could promise to stay together, no sleeping in the mud, no forced marches. They did anyway, you know. But easy it wasn't.
Kind of like the Air Force.
Yes.
my God.
Well, it's,
One other comment, Port Hudson didn't surrender until July the 9th, 5 days later. David Edmonds wrote a 2-volume entitled The Guns of Port Hudson. I don't know if you read it or not.
I probably have read excerpts, if not the whole thing. Which book was it?
The Guns of Port Hudson by David Edmonds, Edmonds.
I've seen a lot of material on it. I don't think I read that particular piece.
My great-grandfather and 3 of his brothers were at Port Hudson, so I was interested in Port Hudson.
Uh-huh.
One of them, the colonel was captured, but he escaped the Maple Leaf on the way to Fort Delaware.
Uh-huh.
Colonel A.R. went, and my great-grandfather Jerry and his brother John and Milton stayed on till they surrendered July the 9th. They were under the command of C.L. Vaughn, who was the lieutenant colonel of the 10th Arkansas. So anyway, that's very, and two, the Unions, they sacrificed the USCTs. Read about, they sent those U.S. colored troops in there to get slaughtered. They were saving the white troops, the Union was saving the white troops, and they were sending in,
Go
We
in
had
with
done it
some,
like up in
you care
Chattanooga.
if you get killed.
they did, they sacrificed
In
USCTs.
Nashville, at Nashville.
Nashville, yeah.
Oh, man, they really sacrificed them there.
Yeah, I'm not convinced they just, did the sacrifice. They put them on these outposts, like at Milliken's Bend. And, or up here at the, hear that train going by, up here at the Sulphur Springs Trestle. A lot of these outposts were garrisoned by the black troops over Decatur, black troops.
Pulaski the same way.
And,
Yeah.
yeah,
Pulaski,
and
Tennessee.
they were easy targets, actually. You know, have you read anything about the legacy of Fort Donelson? There's a Benjamin Franklin Cooling's book, marvelous book. It's very insightful about it gives a lot of accounts, but the legacy basically is Parks and Rangers. They passed the Parks and Ranger Act. So you had all these guys coming out of the woodwork that really did want to join the Army, but hey, I could be a partisan ranger, which, you know, there's a fine line between partisan ranger and bushwhacker. You know, it's just, it gave them a little more honor than draft dodging, but it could be a pretty mean thing. If you read about the guerrilla activities in particularly 2 states, Missouri and Tennessee, it's grim. I mean, it's bloody. It got more bloody, I think, than a typical Army attack on other armies because it was military discipline. Well, if you're a band of freebooters, if you will, you don't have much regard for these things. So this is a chance to get in and say, I really want to kill, And so, there were some people that went overboard on that. And yes, some of the black troops were sacrificed because, after all, those were not considered military significant places in and of themselves. The military significance, as Grant himself put it, was in armies. If it wasn't a massive army fighting another massive army, it wasn't militarily significant. He said the Marine Brigade was militarily insignificant. And boy, I'm telling you, I would venture to say that a unit like that on the waters was worth dozens of brigades on land, if not an entire division. I mean, they were, again, you gotta realize that the waters were the transportation systems, the highways in the South. And whoever ruled on the waters ruled, period, And so, yeah, it's not like you had 10,000 troops shot up, facing off and firing another 10,000 and letting bodies pile up on that. There's only something like, in the Navy, there's something like only 4,000 deaths of sailors in the entire war. Well, that's insignificant, Sure. I don't know. I have kind of a peeve about people who think the only thing that's important is the body counts. If they didn't leave thousands maimed and killed if heaps of blood, blood and gore, then it wasn't important, and nothing could be farther from the truth. So, anyway, that's my spin.
All right, well, appreciate you coming, Kent, very insightful.